Welcome to 30, Flirty, and Nerdy. Today I have Christopher on to talk about HSV2 and herpes and what it's like dating with HSV2. Because we're in our 30s now, we're going to be meeting tons of different people that have STDs, and we want to be aware of that. Growing up, you may not have been as aware of STDs. You might know about it, but you're not really too concerned about it because you haven't had that many partners, or it's just not on your radar as much. And so what Christopher does is he advocates about the stigma and pretty much deflates the stigma, I guess you can say, where it's not as bad as people make it out to be. And so I'm really excited to have Christopher on, and I'm excited to get a little bit more into your story, how you found out about it, what has come up since, and kind of your mission and your goals in life with this diagnosis. So Christopher, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and for talking with me and sharing your story and just kind of being more of an advocate about HSV2, because I feel like people need to be more aware and kind of pay more attention to things like this. So thank you again so much.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Can you please tell the audience a little bit more about who you are, where you're from, and just a little background about your diagnosis and how you found out that you've had HSV too?
So my name is Christopher. I'm going to be 30 soon, from Toronto, Canada, the Great White North. And I guess originally my background was in the fitness industry, and I used to do a lot of content creation regarding fitness, and then kind of hopped over onto TikTok, ended up with herpes in September 2020, kept it a secret basically to the public, posted some fitness content, and then kind of through my own diagnosis journey, started to question the stigma, started to question my beliefs about herpes, and, posted a couple herpes videos on TikTok to see what would happen with 50 followers, and a lot of people reacted well to that situation. And then I kind of just shifted all of my content from fitness into herpes and awareness and education, because I feel like I'm now a very large fish in a very small pond, as opposed to a million other fitness people out there.
Yeah, because on your TikTok, you have 100,000 followers or so. And I feel like the comments, you're really helping people with your content, because I feel like a lot of people are like, oh, I'm not alone, or, oh, I'm, understanding more about this. Thank you so much for your advice and for your help and things like that. So how does that make you feel when you see those comments and you're like, oh, I'm a big fish in a small pond? But it's do you feel like you're really spreading awareness that you haven't had before?
Yeah. I get multiple DMs a day, every platform, whether it's a giant paragraph of thank you so much, I've been struggling with this for 20 years, and I felt bad, and watching your videos helps. Or whether it's people who want answers to questions they don't have because the doctors weren't able to help them, or whether it's people who are confused because there's some people who have false positives or confusing test results, or they don't know if they have it. And initially, when a couple of my first videos blew up, I was like, oh my goodness, how am I ever going to respond to people? I'm so glad I'm helping. And at this point, I'm happy to help everyone, but I'm so used to the thanks now that I think I forget how many people I'm actually affecting in a good way.
Yeah, it's you're affecting so many. You can't really message everyone individually, but the fact that you're helping them and you see that and they say that, it has to be such a good feeling.
Mm-hmm. Especially because I don't think a lot of people are doing what I'm doing, and it's people have been waiting 20 years, not dating or not feeling good, or not having anyone to, I guess, be the voice for them. And then I realized it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more I talk about it, the more it helps, and then the more I continue to talk about it.
I want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Boudoir by Winter. Do you want to feel sexy, beautiful, confident, radiant, and empowered in your own skin? Winter helps with just that. She is a wonderful boudoir photographer and is offering my listeners 15% off a boudoir package if you mention me. No code necessary, just mention me. Feel free to message Winter over on Instagram at Boudoir by Winter. You may also check out her website, boudoirbywinter.com. Embrace your body, embrace your beauty. Thank you so much, Winter, for the sponsorship. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, and so I wanted to ask you quite a few questions about it. So for those that don't know what it is, can you kind of give your definition on what HSV2 is? And then can you also dive into what your diagnosis story was and like how long it took you to accept your own diagnosis and kind of what that process was like for you going through that time?
Mhm. Okay, well, first things first, in like the simplest terms, like herpes and herpes viruses is actually like a family of 8 different viruses. Once any of us contract any of those herpes viruses, like they lay dormant in our body until we die. So the virus that causes chickenpox is a herpes virus. So have you ever had chickenpox?
I have. I did not know
Okay.
that.
Okay. So before anyone gets herpes in my situation, I had chickenpox. The virus that causes chickenpox was still in my body until I die. And that specific virus can reactivate into shingles later in life. So if you knew anyone with shingles or you have shingles, that's also caused by a herpes virus in this family of 8. And I say this just because like I think society has grown up only associating the word herpes with genital herpes, when in reality, if you want to talk about HSV, whether it's type 1 or type 2, those are both herpes viruses that are associated with like causing outbreaks, whether it's orally or whether it's genitally. And I think for a while, people and doctors only thought that type 1 was oral and type 2 was genital. But in fact, they have like site preferences. So type 1 has always been associated with like cold sores, fever blisters, all these cute little names. But in reality, a cold sore and a fever blister is an oral herpes outbreak. Those are temporary in terms of symptoms, but you still have the HSV1 virus in your body till you die. HSV2, it's kind of like an adaptation of that first one because it kind of morphed itself to infect genitals of people who already have HSV1, which is why it's the leading cause of genital herpes and is like rarely passed up here, but it's not impossible. And I think that a majority of the time we just thought they were separate when in reality type 1 could also be down here. So essentially, like people with cold sores, they don't disclose. They're not seen as herpes. It's not seen as something that's like abnormal compared to genital herpes. And I think just to touch on that topic, I think that after all of my research, the stigma comes down to sex and the fact that you had sex and got herpes, as more so than the fact that you got herpes. And sex is always going to be taboo in society. Someone is always going to judge you if you didn't live your life according to how they wanted you to. And I think that when it comes to like initially breaking the stigma, realizing that if someone is going to judge you for getting herpes through sex and they're trying to pursue you for sex, it's a little bit hypocritical. And I think that was like one of the first points when it comes to like analyzing the stigma and realizing what it truly is about. And I guess my diagnosis story that we should talk about.
Yes. Thank you for explaining all about kind of your definition of it and like why it's more of a stigma. And I think you're right. I think it really depends on, you know, HSV1 in your mouth versus HSV2 down in the genitals. And it's kind of like the stigma is sex. And it makes it a little bit worse because it's like, oh, you had sex, you're dirty, you have, you know, this thing, when that's not really the case because a lot of people do have HSV1, but it's not seen all the time, or it's more commonly known as cold sores. And it's like, well, you had cold sores, so you also have this too. But I
I
really
would even
liked your
say that like
explanation.
cold sores are more visible if you were to have an outbreak. And like,
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely more visible. For sure. Like I know I've seen some people with it. I'm like, oh, it's like definitely herpes or it's definitely cold sores. But yeah, so thank you so much for that explanation a little bit about the differences. And can you go into a little bit more about your story, like your diagnosis, if
hmm
you like?
hmm So diagnosed in September 2020, I like met an individual, on a dating app. There's nothing wrong with dating apps. I think there's like a negative connotation, like, you can get herpes from someone outside or someone on a dating app, but just, the ease of access for people. That's where people meet each other nowadays. There wasn't really any discussion of like, sexual health before. I don't think anyone really does that. Like, hey, partner, before we have sex, like, let's get our test results done. Like, nobody really does that. So, engaged in, sex with them. Nothing really happened. There was nothing suspicious. There was no like signs or obvious red flags about anything. And whether they were developing an outbreak at the time and didn't notice, or whether sex caused them to have an outbreak as some sort of trigger, I don't know. But then like the subsequent days we did it again. And I believe that I contracted it like from them during that potential outbreak, as opposed to them like not having symptoms. And then within like 2 to 4 days, started to get painful urination, swollen lymph nodes in my throat and crotch, a dull burning aching pain in my pubic area, and like 20 plus blisters on my pubic area. And I originally thought it was like friction burns or just like, just something that's innocent or something. And then it kind of got worse and worse and worse. And I was like, what is happening? Like, this is not normal. And I remember not feeling shocked. I remember not feeling scared. I was feeling more shocked and like less of like terror and more of like, this is not normal, but like, why am I not freaking out kind of thing? And I think it was shock. And then kind of like asked the girl, did you know you had anything? Or like, do you know what this is? And I don't think she ever knew. I don't think she was educated on herpes. I don't know, think she maybe ever even had an outbreak. At this stage, like, I'm not mad at her. There was a point where I was like, she really knew, and she ruined my life. But after a while, realizing how many issues there are with testing or diagnosis or symptoms or knowledge, it's entirely possible she had no prior knowledge that she had this, and there's no point in being mad at her. And then went to the doctor after I went on Google, self-diagnosed, oh my God, what is herpes? And symptoms, and it said herpes. And I went to the doctor, said, I think I have herpes, can we check? And they did like this, they did a visual exam, they did a swab test, they gave me some medication, they sent me away. Basically, I didn't have a bad experience with the doctor, but I certainly wasn't educated or, consoled about my diagnosis. And then basically just like went home and accepted my fate. And then when the results came, it said HSV2. I was like, okay, that's what I thought. So for me, like before I went to the doctor, I'd kind of already accepted my fate, as opposed to like getting a shocking phone call. And then for the next like couple of months, I basically had like on and off outbreaks and other health concerns that sort of all stressed me out to the point where I wasn't really healing that much. And slowly over time, I just kind of worked on all of my individual health concerns and got better after a couple of months. But it definitely wasn't very fun. I definitely had all of those feelings like I'm going to be alone forever, single, no one's going to date me, I'm disgusting. If I touch anyone, they're going to get herpes. So that's basically it. And then in terms of like kind of getting out of that, I think women are the gatekeepers to sex when it comes to dating. So I kind of never took myself out of the dating field. I would just casually go on dates still with my, with my diagnosis, with no expectation of having to disclose, because if it got to that point, I would have. I think that helped me kind of not let myself be derailed in terms of dating. Like, I have this, I can't date. I was thinking, let me still try to date. And then December 2020, like met someone, got to know them. They were kind of into me, and I had to like disclose for the first time. And I was like super scared. What do I say? How do I say this? And eventually they, I disclosed, I think I have the virus that causes herpes. I take medication to make myself safer. Let me know if you have any questions. And they were a little bit shocked at the beginning, but then a couple of weeks later, they're like, you educated me, and like, you seem like, the risks, and like, okay, I like you as a person. So we had sex and nothing bad happened. And I thought, so I have herpes and I dated and I disclosed and I didn't give them herpes. Like, what's the big deal now, kind of thing. And that kind of like cemented my confidence in terms of questioning, like, how is my life that much different than it was before? And then ended up talking about it on TikTok like a couple months later after I was like fully wondering what the big deal was.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It definitely shows that you had those thoughts of, oh no, like I'm never gonna date again, but you took yourself out there and you were able to prove yourself wrong. And so because you did that, you're trying to kind of prove other people wrong. Like you can do this, you can still date, you can still find someone interested in you, all of that type of stuff. You're kind of proving to others that it is possible from your own experience, which is really cool.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are struggling
Yeah,
for
and
years
definitely in
and
the
years.
comments.
Yeah.
In the comments, I've definitely seen a lot of people struggle and a lot of people question, and the fact that you bring them a little bit of confidence back means a
Hmm.
lot, which I think is really cool and really amazing. And so I also wanted to kind of ask you, since you're pretty much disclosing to TikTok about your diagnosis, did you also disclose to your family and friends? And like, what was their response to that? Or did you kind of just disclose to TikTok and didn't tell your family and friends at all and they found out through TikTok? Like, how did that go for you?
Yeah, the second option. I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell any of my friends initially, didn't tell any family because I felt like I was going through it on my own and I didn't really know. I've always kind of like dealt with things on my own, I think, in terms of support or in terms of like figuring things out. People know now, I think through social media. One of my like bestest friends saw my TikTok and said like, "Oh, I didn't know you were going through this. Like, let me know if you have any, like, let me know if you need anything." And I was like, "Oh, thank you." But like at this point, I'm okay. I remember telling a couple of, like acquaintances. There was a girl I went on a date with a few days before I got herpes, and I messaged her like 2 months later, and I said, "Oh, sorry for like ghosting you. I ended up getting herpes, and I've been dealing with this." And the funny thing about that, like I feel like the universe has its own way of like helping you because she says, "Oh, like I have that too. I have genital HSV1." And I was like, "Really? Like, other people have this?" And then I kind of like found comfort in her in terms of like realizing how common it is. And then another funny story about these like herpes dating apps. There's like dating apps for people with herpes. I went on there just to like check them out, and I saw like two other female friends I had who were on the app, and I had them on Instagram, and they were, living their life on Instagram. And I said, "Whoa, like you guys are living your life, like smiling and okay with your diagnosis." And I reached out to them and said, like, "I saw you on this app. Like, I just got diagnosed. Like, I'm going through like I got questions for you, kind of thing." So I think for me, that's what happened. And then in terms of family, they kind of like just asked me, "How did you get herpes?" And I was like, "How do you think?" And then that was basically the end of the conversation. Because I think at that point, anyone who wants to judge me or has their own opinions of me, like I'll debunk them with whatever my knowledge is at this point. Because I don't feel like I'm a bad person or dirty or should be ashamed of myself for this.
Right. And the knowledge you've done, you definitely can debunk any question that people ask me. Like, well, look at this. Like,
Hmm.
I've read books, I've read articles, I've talked to people, like this is not what you think it is. And it probably
Hmm.
gives them a sense of like, okay, like it's not as big of a deal as people make it out to be.
I refuse to look at oral herpes and genital herpes differently in terms of like a subjective judgment standpoint. So I will never think of myself any, I guess, dirtier than someone who's ever had a cold sore.
That's a really good way to put it because
Mhm.
it's basically the same thing, it's just different location.
Yeah, and if sex is so shameful and taboo, why are we all having sex? Like, let's all stop if there's such a problem with having sex.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Uh,
So I kind of wanted to get into your series of would you date someone with HSV? So what was your thought process behind doing that series? And did you find any interesting stats about that? So for those that don't know, Christopher has a fun kind of series on TikTok where he will go and like ask different people if they would ever date someone that is HSV positive. why did you start doing that? What was your thought process behind that? And again, like, did you find anything interesting while talking to these people?
Okay, so originally, like I had this question before, basically, and I like to consider myself like I was like a content creator who just happened to have herpes. So I was always kind of thinking about like, how do I make videos that will do well, or like what are the trends and stuff. I remember last summer, 2021, actually, I was like, on TikTok trying to find, like what do people like to watch? And everybody loves like street interviews, regardless of the topic. Like I'm sure you've been on TikTok and stopped at one of these like, hey, like rich boyfriend or attractive or like that kind of stuff. And people like that stuff, people it goes viral. And I was kind of thinking like, maybe I should do something herpes related, like do some street interviews. So I went like in Toronto, I went downtown, and I originally just did the same basic questions as I do now, just kind of get the general consensus. Like, what do you think of the word herpes? Would you date someone with herpes? And just like choppy interviews up into a bunch of different clips and posted them. And like some of them did quite well, because I think a lot of people want to know. And it's like, if you have never had herpes too, you're probably going to like watch the video if it's like within the first 3 seconds on TikTok, And I think that question, would you date someone with herpes, like just like that, has always gotten people's attention. And I was also curious to like, what are people going to say? And in terms of like the statistics I found is that the internet is a lot more harsh than real life. I think a lot of people are more judgmental and mean in the comments, like, no, bro, that's dirty, that's dirty. And in person, a lot of people are more like open and accepting, or like, if I like the person, or like, I'm not educated on this, but I'd like to know more. Or in public, it's a different consensus. And I've also noticed that a lot of people do get cold sores and admit it, but don't know it's herpes, and especially don't know that you can get type 1 down there. And I think that whilst we're always going to have people who are ignorant to like my questions and ignorant to my points, there are people out there who genuinely are like having their mind changed because of the questions. Because I think a lot of people have no reason to change their mind unless they have to get this. Because for me, all of my ideas about the stigma and about herpes were the same as everyone else's until I got herpes and said, oh, so it's not a constant symptomatic, disgusting mess down there that anyone touches and just gets herpes. Like typically we don't fact check unless we have to, because we're lazy.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for answering that. I didn't know you had that question before, so it's kind of funny that I thought of it as well. But it is really kind of cool that you talk to all these different people and they sometimes don't know, but they're like more kinder in person about it.
Mm-hmm.
I do remember one of your videos where the guy was like, no, man, I wouldn't date anyone with herpes, and yet they had like herpes on their mouth, but you're like, but you have it. And they're like, that's different. That's it's like kind of interesting how people kind of view it and go about it just from that question.
Yeah, that's like a video from like 2 days ago. Everyone's going off about that.
Yeah, yeah. Like I
um,
said, I binge your videos, so I'm like,
yeah,
that's so funny how that person thought that way. But
yeah. Like as
I
an
don't know.
example, like some of my videos will get like 5,000 views, and like ones like that will do like 450,000. And it's just like, if I can help more people see the video, more people can benefit from the herpes. And in that situation, yeah, I'll just go in depth on the contradictory, which is like, he has oral herpes, or people out there in general, anyone can be in a situation. You have oral herpes, genital herpes or oral herpes could still be passed by a small chance when there's no symptoms present. Neither of them are constant symptoms. People with it up here can pass it to someone's genitals, but they're not typically disclosed, and people typically don't even realize it's herpes. So if someone was to just not want to date someone with any form of herpes, despite the fact that they have herpes that they don't disclose and could pass to someone too, that's the contradiction right there. Because he could, in the past or in the future, give someone type 1 genital herpes. And while it may be, physically different in terms of its like diagnosis process and lifestyle than type 2, it's the label of genital herpes, regardless of the type, that affects people. And he's not really giving people that choice, but he wouldn't date someone with herpes.
It just doesn't make sense. Hopefully they learn. in the future and they do more research, I'm like, oh yeah, I guess that guy was right. I should be more careful about what I say and think. Okay, so you pretty much answered more of my questions than I thought you would, but it's just kind of like how we go into
Mhm,
conversation. I guess I have a few more questions for you. Do you
mhm.
wish you could cure your status now, or do you wish you never had it?
I wish I
Does that
could
make
cure it
sense?
now in
Mhm.
addition to everyone else. Like if there's a public cure and it actually works, that would be great. I don't think anyone would knowingly, or I don't think anyone would voluntarily want to keep their status. But if I could go back and not get it, I don't know if I would, because I feel like the positive outcome of me, one person getting it on everyone else has been like worth it in that way.
No, that's an awesome answer. Thank you for
Mhm,
that. Yeah, because you do help so many people. You see it in the comments, you see it in the responses that you get, and it's so, so good. And that is a great answer. So thank you for that. And thank you for doing what you're doing. And I guess my last question for you is what advice would you give 30-year-olds about dating in this time and day and age? That makes sense.
mhm.
Okay.
So I would say in regards to just sexual health, dating and herpes, I would say that safe sex doesn't really exist. HPV and HSV are so common and they could be passed by a small chance with protection as well. Protection won't eliminate that risk. Most sexually active adults have never been tested for herpes. Some sexually active adults have never been tested in general, probably guys. And everyone, when they're dating, is probably putting themselves at risk of contracting oral herpes or genital herpes, regardless of whether they know it or not, but you may never contract it. And I think that it's important to educate ourselves about STIs or the risks before we end up with something, because potentially that prior knowledge will help us not get it. But oftentimes we just kind of close our eyes and hope for the best, and then we end up with situations like this.
Thank you so much for that advice and for being on the podcast today and for sharing your story and for advocating for HSV2 and HSV. And it's really important. And I think people that listen to this will kind of do more research and think about dating in the future and kind of be more prepared while going on dating apps and meeting new people and getting to that further step. If they are negative, if they're positive with anything, it's definitely important to get daily checkups is
Mhm.
all that is important. And yeah, so thank you again so much for being on here. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to help. And if anyone out there is struggling with this diagnosis, like, you know, there is help out there and everything will be okay.
Hey friends, thank you for listening to today's episode. Please take a moment to follow and review this podcast so it could reach others. Also, if you leave a review, I'll be sharing your review in the next episode. Lastly, if you want to be part of this growing podcast to chat about your life, your profession, passions, or if you have advice that you wish you had at 30, please sign up at the link provided in the show notes. I would love to have you as a guest on the show. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.